17 million people were once left starving on this land. Children drank from rusted cans filled with rain and dirt. The elderly died quietly, their names forgotten, their graves unmarked. The world didn't weep. It moved on, charting maps, drafting aid agreements, sending food that never reached the hungry, until one man appeared. His name was TRAORÉ. Not a banker, not a general. He didn't study in Paris, didn't shake hands in boardrooms. He picked up a shovel and walked into a land that had been abandoned by everyone except its own people. They said it was too late, too dry, too broken. But when bananas started growing in the red dust, when schools reopened and wells overflowed, when the EU called him a dangerous precedent, the world finally turned its head. Can fruit feed more than hunger? Can a tree rewrite a nation's fate? What you're about to hear is a story imagined, but born from truths too deep to ignore. No names were borrowed, no borders were redrawn. But the pain, the pride, the fight to be seen, those are real. Because sometimes fiction is the only way to tell the truth. Not the kind of silence that soothes, the kind that suffocates. The screen is scorched with light, a horizon trembling in heat waves. Earth cracked open like old porcelain. Nothing grows here, not even shadows. Then a creak. A rusted jerry can dragged across dirt. She's no older than 7. Her feet are bare, her lips cracked. She balances the can with both hands, though it's nearly empty. Each step she takes leaves a puff of red dust in the air, the trail behind her glowing like faded embers. The camera stays low, following her ankles as they weave through broken fences, collapsed huts, and a water pump rusted into silence. This was once a village. Now it's an echo. In the distance, a goat skeleton lies, half-buried bones, curled like it's still bracing for rain that never came. She reaches a dried-up well, stands still, looks down. Nothing. She doesn't cry. Children here no longer waste water that way. They used to call it the land of dust. The narrator begins. Burkina Faso, a name that once filled foreign ledgers with donation lines. A country spoken of in policy reports, not poems. A dot on a map neatly boxed in statistics. GDP, 1%, 40%, food insecurity, aid reliant. Then one by one, the aid convoys stopped coming. The helicopters that once dropped sacks of grain became rare. The officials who promised resilience programs disappeared from press photos. IMF emails went unanswered. Meetings were postponed indefinitely. What was left were photocopied pledges fading on government walls, and empty warehouses filled with hope that expired with the bags it came in. The global north turned its back. They called it donor fatigue. Here they just called it hunger. But then, the camera cuts. It's early morning, somewhere far from the capital. The light is soft, the kind of light that hides secrets. A man kneels in the dirt. His shirt is soaked through. There's no flag behind him, no motorcade, no microphones. Just a spade, just soil. He presses a handful of dirt between his fingers, brings it to his nose, smells it. Still alive, he murmurs. This is not how presidents usually appear. But Ibrahim Traoré was not a usual president. No suit, no briefcase, only a shovel, and a scar across his left temple that no camera ever explained. Around him, children stare from the distance. A few elders watch silently from behind banana leaves, not planted, but drawn crudely on the walls of a broken school. Traoré digs again, slow, deliberate. A journalist whispers off camera, "Is this symbolic or just desperate?" He doesn't answer. Not yet. Instead, he leans forward and speaks low to no one and everyone. We stopped asking for permission. The words settle like dust, gentle but permanent. They don't sound like a slogan. They sound like a vow. Cut to a scene later that day. He walks through the village, past a girl holding an empty bowl, past a teacher erasing math problems about food supply because the children have stopped coming to class. He stops in front of an old map on a crumbling wall. Lines drawn in colonial ink roads that go outward, arrows that leave red circles marking extraction zones, none for planting, none for returning. He stares at the map, then tears it down with both hands. The camera doesn't cut away. He draws instead, on the wall, with chalk, with fingers. He draws boxes, not for borders but for bananas, cotton, cocoa. He circles a patch in the north, whispers, "This will be green." But who is he really? Why does a man with no economists, no global summit, no Harvard degree believe he can change a dead land? And more urgently, why do others begin to believe him? In the final seconds of the scene, the little girl with the jerrycan returns. She sees the dirt on his hands. She sees the shovel. She places her empty can next to his feet like an offering, then turns and sits, quietly, watching. This isn't just the story of a president. It's the story of a nation that once forgot how to hope and a people now willing to remember. Because in a place where nothing grows, sometimes the only thing left to plant is belief. The room was barely a room, 4 walls of uneven concrete, a leaking zinc roof, and a door that never really closed. There were no chairs, only crates, overturned buckets, and one rusting oil drum that served as a table. At the center, a single light bulb swung from the ceiling like a tired pendulum, casting long shadows that danced across the cracked floor. This was the meeting room in the far north of Burkina Faso, where maps don't reach where foreign aid workers once flew in by chopper, but now wouldn't even answer emails. The power flickered twice before staying on. No fan, no air, just the heat of too many bodies and the thick silence of people waiting not for promises, but for something else. Ibrahim Traoré stood near the door, not at the center. He didn't speak. He wasn't flanked by security or advisors. He wore a loose, faded shirt rolled at the sleeves and a pair of worn boots caked in mud. On his left hand, the scar was clearer now, running like a thin crack from his thumb to wrist. He rubbed it unconsciously as if remembering something painful, then placed his hand flat on the oil drum. The room stayed quiet. Then from the shadows, she stepped forward. Aminata. Her walk was slow, not because she was old, but because she carried the weight of something more permanent than age loss. She wore a headscarf dyed in indigo, hands calloused, and eyes that had seen hunger carve through a village like wildfire. She had buried both her sons during the last drought. One died of fever when the clinic ran out of saline, the other of thirst just meters from a dry well. No one remembered which came first, the famine or the funeral. What she carried with her now was not a petition, not a demand. It was a rolled piece of paper, soft at the edges, stained by time. She unwrapped it slowly and placed it on the oil drum without a word. The paper unfurled a hand-drawn design of an irrigation system. Banana rows, compost trenches, solar-powered pumps. In the corner, a name, hers, and a date, 2009. There was a long pause. Someone in the back cleared their throat. Another scoffed under their breath. A few shook their heads, old ideas drawn by old pain. But Traoré said nothing. He bent down. He studied the drawing like it was a sacred text. He didn't blink, didn't nod, just traced the lines with one finger as though following a map to buried treasure, except the treasure here wasn't gold. It was dignity. She's been bringing that paper for 14 years, someone whispered. Every governor, every minister, no one even looked. Still, Traoré remained silent. Then his eyes lifted not to the paper, but to the back wall of the room. A large map of the region was tacked there, yellowed and brittle. Red lines snaked through it, railways, mines, checkpoints, all legacies of men in far-off offices who never drank this heat, never heard these cries. He walked over to it, stood still. Then with one slow, deliberate motion, he ripped the map clean off the wall. Gasps broke the room. He turned back toward the group paper in one hand, torn map in the other. This map, he said quietly, was never drawn by those who cried here. He let the paper fall. There was silence, but not the same silence from before. This one was leaning forward. Traoré walked back to the oil drum, looked at Aminata, and nodded once. No applause, no announcement. But in that room full of scorched hope, something shifted. Not everything. Not yet, but something. Later, as people drifted out into the night, the bulb flickered once and died. But no one noticed, because what they had seen wasn't electricity. It was the first spark of belief. The village of TRAORÉ stood at the end of a road that hadn't been marked on any official map for years. The asphalt had long since surrendered to gravel and then to dust. Aid trucks used to stop here. Then they used to pass through. Then they stopped coming at all. People stopped counting how long ago that was. It was the dry season. But then again, every season had begun to feel like the dry one. There were no speeches, no ceremonies, no ribbon cutting, just a single iron rod hammered into the earth, marking the center of the village square. And beside it, a group of men and women, thin, silent, gripping shovels with hands that hadn't worked land in months. Not because they didn't want to, but because the land had long ago stopped listening. Ibrahim Traoré stood among them. He didn't stand apart or above. His hands were wrapped in cloth. His shirt was soaked in the back. He didn't give orders. He just dug. The dirt was stiff, like dried blood. Each layer was harder than the last. Shovels bent. Fingernails cracked. On the second day, blisters formed. On the third, they burst. On the fourth, people began to murmur, not loud, but loud enough to be heard. This ground is cursed. Even the worms left. We're just burying hope. On the fifth day, one man left. Then two. Aminata stayed. So did Traoré. He no longer used gloves. The cloth had worn through. His palms had split thin red veins threading through the brown of his skin. But he kept going slow and steady, like he was carving through time itself. By the sixth morning, the hole was as deep as a man. They had found nothing, not even dampness, only layers of stone that laughed back at every strike of the pickaxe. That morning, a child passed by. The same girl from before, the one with the jerry can. She stood at the edge of the pit, looking down at the broken men inside it. Then quietly she turned the can upside down. Not a drop came out. That was when Traoré spoke. Sometimes, he said, the land doesn't give until you prove you're not leaving. No one answered. No one had the strength. Then around midday, a different sound. The sound didn't belong. It was soft shy, a whisper, the kind of sound you're not sure you heard until everyone stops moving at once. One of the men dropped to his knees. He pressed his hand to the bottom of the pit. His fingers trembled. Then he shouted. But it wasn't the kind of shout you hear in movies. It wasn't joy. It was disbelief, raw, afraid to hope, as if saying it too loud might scare it away. Traoré climbed down slowly. He knelt, pressed his own palm to the wet patch in the earth. His lips parted, not in a smile but in awe. A minute later, the mud cracked. Then it rose. A sudden hiss, then a gasp, and then water. A thin jet at first, then wider, then rising. The pit filled to their ankles, then to their knees. People didn't cheer. They didn't jump. They just stood there dazed, as if waiting for someone to tell them this was a mistake. Aminata covered her mouth. She sank to the ground. Her shoulders shook, but no sound came. The girl with the jerry can stared wide-eyed, clutching the empty plastic as if it might shatter. No one moved. Then Traoré looked up. The sky above him was still dry, still brutal, but his voice was calm. It wasn't just water, he said. It was the end of waiting, and finally someone wept. Before he became a myth, before the whispers and the rumors and the half-true tales passed from village to village, he was a soldier, a commander, decorated, feared, precise. They called him Zeta, not his birth name, but the one he earned in the field, stamped onto reports and whispered into radios during border skirmishes and night raids. He was the kind of man whose silence made other men straighten up. His uniform had seen more years of war than peace, and his boots had walked through countries even his superiors had forgotten. But when the new government offered him a full pension, a driver, a house in the capital, and a speaking role at military parades, Zeta refused. He had one request: give me 20 hectares of land. They thought he was joking. They laughed. He didn't. He didn't want medals. He didn't want an office. He didn't even want to write memoirs. He wanted dirt, and so they gave it to him. 20 hectares of cracked earth outside a village called Cumbia. The kind of land the ministry had labeled non-strategic. Too dry, too remote, too forgotten. No one objected. Zeta arrived with nothing but a tent, a toolbox, and a notebook wrapped in plastic. He pitched the tent at the edge of the field, drove in 4 iron stakes, and began to work. There were no welcome committees, no media, just wind and silence. He dug trenches by hand, dug until his hands blistered, then bled, then blistered again. He dragged broken pipes, scraps from abandoned construction sites, and fused them together to build an irrigation network. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't clean, but it worked. The village watched from afar. Children peeked through bushes. Elders muttered. One woman laughed and said, "A soldier who plants trees is just a tree waiting to fall." By the second week, the first rows were ready, shallow beds in uneven rows lined with mulch made from dead grass and dried leaves. By the third, the villagers had a new name for him, the Mad Colonel. They said he talked to the dirt, said he knelt in the moonlight whispering to the rose like fallen comrades, that he saluted the banana saplings. But no one could deny what was happening. The field, once nothing but bone-dry clay, began to change. A shimmer of green here, a flicker of new roots there. Water flowed through the pipes, slow but steady, like veins waking after a long sleep. Zeta refused help, at first, but when a boy named Mahamadi wandered into the field and asked, "Do banana trees stand like soldiers?" Zeta nodded. "Straighter," he said, "because they feed, not fight." By the end of the month, Zeta was no longer working alone. 3 boys helped him carry sacks of compost. 2 girls painted signs for each crop row. 1 widow brought leftover bread every morning. No one called him mad anymore, not out loud. And yet someone finally asked, not out of mockery but of honest confusion, why would a man who fought all his life choose to plant Zeta stopped mid-dig? He straightened his back, looked at his hands calloused, bleeding brown with soil, and said, "I've taken enough. Let me grow something now." Those words traveled faster than trucks. In a country where most people had only ever seen soldiers with rifles, the image of one kneeling to plant something. It didn't make sense, but it also couldn't be ignored. By the end of the season, Zeta's field had sprouted its first full row of bananas, 27 trees, short and stubborn, clinging to life with the tenacity of orphans. Not perfect, not pretty, but alive. And so was he. Because for the first time in decades, Zeta wasn't giving orders. He was listening to the wind, to the soil, to the silence between footsteps. And the land long ignored was starting to speak back. Zeta planted each banana tree with the precision of a field commander, marking positions on a battlefield. The rows were perfectly aligned, not for aesthetics, but for discipline. Spacing was measured, depth was exact. Orientation followed the sun. He didn't scatter seeds, he deployed them. Each sapling was cradled into the earth like a soldier returning home. And as he watered them, he called out names, not of plants, but of men. Bamba, 2nd Battalion, 2007. He poured water slowly, letting it soak. Dumbia, Border Raid, 2003. The soil darkened beneath the roots. The leaves swayed slightly as if saluting. Hamadou, 1st sniper I trained. Never missed. Never came back. There were 27 trees in the first row, one for each name he could never forget but had nowhere to place. No graves, no plaques, no medals sent to mothers. Now they stood in the field, green and stubborn, soaking in sun and memory. The villagers didn't understand at first. They whispered again this time, not in mockery but in fear. There was something sacred in how he moved. Not madness, something else. Like he was praying without words. A boy asked him once, "Do you miss the war?" Zeta didn't answer immediately. He wiped his brow, checked the irrigation valve, looked out over the field. "Sometimes," he said, "but not the violence. I miss the clarity. In war, you know what you're destroying. In peace, it's harder to know what you're building." When the banana trees bore fruit, they came all at once, bursting yellow among the green, heavy and sudden like blessings long withheld. The smell filled the village. For many children, it was the first time they'd seen ripe bananas on a tree, not in someone else's market stall. Traders from the south came, offered prices, left contracts. Zeta turned them all away. He took the first batch, carefully packed in crates lined with dry grass, and loaded them onto a borrowed truck. The villagers assumed he was finally going to sell them, but instead he drove to the district hospital. The doctor on duty blinked when she saw him at the gate, covered in dust, holding a crate like an offering. "I brought food for the patients," he said. She gestured at the crates. "All of this," Zeta nodded. "You don't charge for bullets during war. You shouldn't charge for fruit after it." He delivered more to the local school. Kids ran up to touch the crates, not quite believing the smell was real. A few even licked the skins before eating, just in case sweetness was a trick. The press caught wind. A state journalist came with a camera crew expecting some grand speech. Instead, they found Zeta pruning leaves with a machete, shirtless, mud to his knees, sweat pouring like rainfall. They asked him, "Do you regret leaving the military?" Zeta paused, then looked straight into the lens. "I still fight," he said. "I've just changed my target." The clip went viral. In a region battered by instability and distrust, A former commander planting fruit instead of flags struck a chord. He wasn't preaching revolution. He was showing recovery. Other veterans visited. One stayed, then two. They didn't ask for land or pay. They brought tools, memories, names to bury. By the end of the second season, the field had grown to 3 hectares. Each row bore a name, some old, some new, and the banana trees once seen as soft stood straight like soldiers who had survived the war but chose never to return. Not long ago, the children of Cumbia spent their afternoons tracing maps to Europe in the dirt. They spoke of Marseille, of Milan, of the sea. Not because they had been there, but because they had heard enough to believe life began only once you left. The banana field changed that. At first they came out of boredom, watching the strange old soldier muttering to trees. Then they came out of curiosity, and finally they came with notebooks. Zeta never invited them. He never asked. But he never sent them away. He started leaving tools on the edge of the field, small hose, watering can sticks sharpened into row markers. Some were taken, some were returned cleaner than before. The next day there were more children, then teenagers, then young men. They watched how he turned compost, how he tested soil by scent, how he checked the angle of leaves to read wind patterns. And Zeta began to teach not through lectures, but through repetition, rhythm, and instinct. He didn't speak much. When he did, his words stuck like seeds in dry ground. "Dig with your ears," he once said. "The land speaks, but not loudly." One morning, a student named Suleiman, tall and restless, asked him while pruning leaves, "Do you ever miss giving orders?" Zeta wiped sweat from his brow, looked at the boy, and smiled for the first time anyone could remember. "Now the land commands me," he said. It wasn't a metaphor, it was a fact. He woke when the wind shifted. He adjusted watering schedules to moonlight. He studied pests like enemy movement, and the children learned to do the same. Word spread quickly. Soon what had started as a retired soldier's eccentric garden became a gathering place. Zeta split the field into sectors. Each group of students ages 12 to 20 was assigned a plot. They were responsible for planting, watering, harvesting, and recording everything. They called themselves the Green Brigade. At first it was a joke mocking the idea of an army of farmers. But Zeta embraced it. He had wooden tags carved with each student's name and drove them into the soil next to their plants. At the end of each week, he held silent inspections. Not for punishment, but for precision. The fields grew faster than expected. And so did the students. They started building their own irrigation models. They repurposed soda bottles as seed starters, designed shading systems from cloth scraps, mixed ash and garlic to repel insects. One boy built a moisture meter from radio parts. By the 6th month, the field no longer looked like a field. It looked like a living laboratory. TRAORÉ visited once unannounced. He walked quietly through the rows, watching the students test pH strips and draw their own farm maps by hand. When he reached Zeta, he said nothing, just offered a handshake. The respect passed without words. Then the Ministry of Agriculture sent a letter. Then 2. By the time the 3rd letter came, Zeta responded with a new sign posted at the edge of the banana grove: Green Brigade Training Site, Class Capacity 100. By the year's end, they had to turn people away. Students came from other villages, some from other provinces. They walked, biked, hitched rides. None asked for scholarships. They brought seeds as payment, ideas as currency. Zeta began compiling a curriculum not on paper, but on rows. Each sector of the field had a lesson, each harvest a test. And the children who once drew escape routes in the dirt now drew planting grids. They no longer dreamed of leaving. They dreamed of growing. Because under the harsh sun of Cumbia, something had finally begun to bloom that couldn't be bought or sold belonging. She had outlived both her sons. The first was taken by cholera, the second by a militia. No one ever told her why or where his body lay. The war didn't knock, it entered like dust under the door. When it left, it took everything soft with it. Now Mumbarka lived alone in a one-room hut made of sun-baked clay and rusted tin perched on the edge of a plateau that no one visited unless they were lost. Her hands were cracked, her spine curved like the hills behind her, and her eyes faded but not dimmed, still held a flame too stubborn to die. The land around her was dry. Too dry for sorghum, too rough for maize. It hadn't rained in 4 months, but she didn't check the sky anymore. Hope was for people who still had someone to explain disappointment to. What she did have, however, was pickled cucumbers. Old family recipe. Salted in ceramic jars buried underground. The flavor strong enough to wake the dead if only they were still hungry. One morning before the sun rose too high, she placed 2 jars in a straw bag, wrapped her feet in cloth, and began walking. 5 kilometers to the nearest road. Then she waited. 2 hours later, a supply truck passed by headed toward the provincial center. She held up the bag. The driver laughed. "I don't take payment in pickles, Auntie." "Then take it as a gift," she said, "and give me a seat as a debt." He let her in. When they arrived at the government depot where seedlings were being distributed to registered cooperatives and farming groups, Mumbarka waited in line with men half her age and women with smartphones. She had neither paperwork nor an invitation, but when her turn came, she opened her bag. The young man at the desk looked confused. "What is this heritage?" she said. "And I came for a tree." He blinked. "You mean a banana sapling?" "I mean exactly what I said." The line behind her grew restless. Someone muttered about old people wasting time, but the clerk, perhaps out of curiosity or a momentary lapse in protocol, handed her a sapling. It was barely a meter tall. Green, fragile, still unsure of the world. Mumbarka nodded once, then turned and walked away. The driver who brought her was gone, so she walked. It took her the rest of the day and most of the evening to get home. The sun blistered her back. The tree bent once in the wind but didn't break. Neither did she. At dawn the next morning, she took her only shovel, a rusted thing that had once been used to bury her husband, and dug a hole behind the house. Her fingers trembled, not from fatigue, but from something else she couldn't name. She placed the sapling into the earth, packed it tight, and poured the last of her stored water onto its base. Then she sat beside it, legs crossed, skirt dusty, breathing heavy. A neighbor passing by stopped. "Planting bananas here, you'll die before it bears fruit." Mumbarka didn't look up. "I'm not planting promises," she said. "I'm planting refusal. Refusal to be erased." That night she spoke to the sapling. Not loudly, not in ceremony. Just simple words muttered like a bedtime story. She told it of her sons, of the smell of rain when she was a girl, of a world that once believed in itself. The sapling didn't answer, but its leaves shifted slightly, catching a breeze that hadn't been felt in weeks. In the months that followed, no miracle happened. But the tree lived, and so did she. She brought it water in small bowls, sheltered it during sandstorms. And when reporters came, alerted by someone from the depot who remembered the woman with pickles, they found her sitting under its shade, back straight, eyes sharp. One asked, "What are you hoping for?" She didn't blink. "I'm not hoping," she said. "I'm remembering." And in the silence that followed, the camera caught a truth that no headline ever would. Some people grow things not to survive, but to refuse to disappear. Every morning, just before the sky turned fully gold, Mumbarka would step outside with a tin bowl filled with water. Not much, only what she could spare. Sometimes it was the cooled remains from boiled rice. Sometimes a bit of rainwater collected in a cracked basin during one of the year's rare blessings. She would walk barefoot across the hard-packed ground, her movements deliberate, her breath steady. Her body had aged into angles, but her hands were steady and her spine held more pride than pain. She knelt beside her banana tree, the only green thing within 50 meters, and poured the water gently at its base. Then she sang. Not loudly, not for performance. She sang lullabies once meant for her sons. Songs about rivers, about waiting, about coming home. Her voice, hoarse with age, carried strangely through the still air, clinging to the leaves like morning dew. It was the kind of sound that made birds stop mid-call, as if listening in reverence. She would speak to the tree between verses, tell it the weather, warn it about rough winds, joke about goats eyeing it too closely. The villagers had long stopped finding it odd. In fact, some now brought her buckets after cleaning their homes. Others left vegetable scraps she could turn into compost. A few sat with her, silently learning which weeds to pull and which to leave. But the land remained unforgiving. One night the winds howled harder than usual. The storm didn't come with rain, just fury. Dust slammed against the walls like fists. The roofs rattled. Chickens scattered. Doors slammed shut with no one to open them. By morning the sky had calmed. But the tree was down. Its young trunk had cracked near the base, the leaves shredded the roots, gasping. Mumbarka stood over it in silence. Her hands trembled, but not from shock. The villagers gathered slowly, cautious, unsure of what to say. Someone muttered, "It's okay, Auntie." It was just a tree. She didn't look up. She knelt beside it, brushed dirt from the roots, and said nothing. A boy stepped closer, hesitant. "We can try to get you a new one," he offered. Mumbarka wiped her face with the back of her hand, leaving a streak of earth on her cheek. Then softly but without sadness, she answered, "If my sons can fight war, I can fight soil." She began digging, not as fast as she once could, but with care, precision. She cleared the damaged roots, examined what remained, found a sliver of green still alive at the core. She placed the young shoot into a new hole deeper than before, packed it with softened compost, shaded it with a makeshift canopy of palm fronds. She sang again that evening, and again the next morning. 3 days later, new leaves peeked out, small but defiant. That was when others began to bring their own shoots. Some from TRAORÉ's depot, some smuggled from roadside vendors. Mumbarka showed them where to plant, how far to space, when to water. The field behind her house expanded 5 trees, then 12. Children painted stones to mark rows. A girl brought leftover chalk from school to label each tree by name. Someone called it a banana nursery. But Mumbarka shook her head. "Not banana," she said. "Hope." By the end of the season, there were 24 trees, none perfect, a few leaning, one stubbornly refusing to grow more than 2 leaves. But they were alive, and so was something else, a sense that survival wasn't about waiting for help. It was about replanting again and again until the ground learned your name. It began quietly. At harvest, Mumbarka picked the first bunch of ripe bananas, 12 perfect fruits, golden and full warm from the sun. She didn't weigh them. She didn't count how long it had taken. She simply knocked on her neighbor's door and left half the bunch without a word. The next day, she brought a few to the local school, placing them gently in the teacher's hands. "For the ones who forget to eat," she said. A week later, word had spread. Mothers arrived at her garden carrying bowls. Some brought cassava to trade, others brought nothing but empty hands and hungry children. Mumbarka gave what she had. She asked no questions, took no notes. "I'm not a market," she said. "I'm a memory," and the field kept giving. By the second month, 24 trees had become 30. Volunteers came daily. A boy named Amadou helped dig irrigation trenches. A widow offered to tend the trees during Mumbarka's rest hours. They didn't ask for ownership. They understood the rules. Everything that grew was shared. A ledger was eventually kept, not for inventory, but for names, to track how many mouths were being fed. By the end of the harvest cycle, the number was written in chalk across a wall behind her house: 300. 300 people had eaten from her field. Not once, not symbolically, regularly. Children no longer went to school dizzy. Elders no longer chose between medicine and food. One family no longer had to split a meal of cassava gruel 5 ways. She never charged a coin. She only asked, "Will you help me water tomorrow?" The impact rippled far beyond the village. Rumors reached the capital. The Ministry of Agriculture, eager to document success for a quarterly report, sent a young journalist and a cameraman to interview her. They arrived in pressed shirts and dusty shoes, holding microphones like weapons. Mumbarka was pruning dead leaves when they approached. She didn't stop. "Madam Mumbarka," the reporter said, "the country would love to hear your words." She looked up briefly, then returned to her work. "Show the trees," she said. "Not my face." The reporter hesitated. "But people want to know who saved this village." She wiped sweat from her brow, stood slowly, and pointed at the trees. "These did. I just listened." They filmed her anyway, not speaking, just working, her hands scooping compost, her fingers wiping dust from leaves, her back bent not from weakness but devotion. No soundtrack, no narration. When the short documentary aired 2 weeks later in the provincial center, the village school hosted a special evening. They set up a borrowed projector against the classroom wall, hung a white sheet like a movie screen, and the entire village came. People sat on benches, crates, even the ground. Someone brought roasted corn. Children leaned on parents' knees. The air was thick with the smell of banana and wood smoke. When Mumbarka appeared on screen, kneeling beside her tree, pouring water from her tin bowl, the room fell completely silent. No one spoke, until a small voice, barely above a whisper, broke the stillness. A boy no more than 6 turned to his mother and said, "She fed the whole village with 2 hands." And no one corrected him, because somehow it was true. The pencil wasn't really a pencil. It was a stick whittled smooth, dipped in ink, made from charred banana stem and cassava water. But to Samira, 6 years old and barefoot, it was more powerful than any sword. Her fingers held it tightly, hovering above a page of thick paper crinkled at the corners from reuse. A bead of sweat traced her cheek, not from the heat but from focus. Her tongue poked slightly from her mouth as she bent lower, determined. The first letter was shaky, the second crooked. By the third she stopped, frowned, erased it with the edge of her hand, and started again. Each stroke was deliberate, as if drawing from memory something she had never been allowed to know. Her name, Samira. When she finished, she stared at it for a moment, then looked up at her teacher wide-eyed, waiting for confirmation. The teacher knelt beside her and nodded. "That's you." Samira's face lit up, not with pride, but with something deeper. Recognition. For the first time in her life, she saw proof that she existed in the world. On paper, in ink, underlined by her own hand. Outside, the school buzzed with noise, chairs being dragged, chalk scratching, children laughing. But beneath it all was a deeper sound, low and rhythmic, the hum of machines from the packing house next door. It wasn't distracting, it was familiar, reassuring, like a drumbeat reminding them that the world was still moving, and that this time it was moving with them. The school was new, built beside the banana packing plant as part of the Feed and Teach initiative sparked by TRAORÉ's reforms. For every 5 hectares of commercial crops, one community service project was required: a clinic, a canteen, or in this case, a school. It was simple. One rectangular building with 3 classrooms and a shaded courtyard. But it was clean, bright, and filled with things most rural children had never seen: colored pencils, maps that showed their country in the center, books with stories where the heroes spoke their names. Samira's mother, Halima, stood outside the fence watching through the slats. She had come during her break from the factory floor, still in her work apron, the smell of ripe banana clinging to her sleeves. When she saw her daughter hold up the paper, grinning, she pressed a hand to her mouth. The supervisor beside her, clipboard in hand, glanced over. "Your girl?" Halima nodded, blinking back something she couldn't quite swallow. "I saw my name on paper when I was 20, she whispered. "She's 6. The factory had its own rhythm. Conveyor belts churning. Boxes being folded, taped, labeled. Each crate stamped Produit du Faso, Bananes Organiques. Trucks came every afternoon, bound for Ouagadougou, Dakar, even Casablanca. But none of that felt more valuable than what Halima saw in her daughter's small hands, a future that didn't begin with escape, but with education. At lunch, the children poured into the yard. Samira ran to the fence, waving her page like a flag. "Mama, look." Halima smiled and held out her hands, fingers stained with banana sap, reaching for her daughter's history in the making. Later that week, the factory quieted for a few minutes, an unusual pause so the workers could attend a short ceremony. A group of students had written essays titled, "What the Land Gave Us." Samira's was read aloud by her teacher because she couldn't yet read it herself. In it, she wrote, "The trees feed us. The machines send the food. But my pencil grows the future." No one clapped. Not at first. They were too still, absorbing the words from a 6-year-old with ink-stained hands. But eventually someone did. Then another. Then the whole courtyard was filled with applause, not loud but steady like rain, finally arriving after too long. In a land that had forgotten its children, Samira's name was now written. Not in sand, not in fading chalk, but in ink and in memory. The crate was nothing special. Just a wooden box nailed together from reused planks once filled with bananas, bound for the port city. It still bore the faded ink stamp Produit du Faso, Grade A, Lot 041. Its corners were splintered, its bottom slightly bowed from months of weight. When it returned from its last delivery, no one thought to reuse it, except for Fatou, the school's youngest librarian, though she'd never been trained, and the library was really just 3 shelves in the back of a classroom. When she found the crate behind the packing house, discarded and dusty, she paused. She didn't see a box. She saw a corner. She dragged it loud and awkward across the courtyard, took an old tarp from the tool shed, piled inside a handful of storybooks donated by an aid worker 2 years ago, along with a few reading primers and a handmade alphabet chart. Then with chalk, she wrote on the side in big clumsy letters, "Reading Nest." At first only 2 children came, then 5. By the third afternoon, it was full legs dangling over the edge's elbows, knocking voices whispering words into the warm air like secrets too important to lose. One day, a boy with bright eyes and a torn collar sat inside his knees, pulled up tight, a book resting on his thighs. His name was Ibrahim, barely 7. He had just learned to sound out full sentences. He pointed at the crate's side, touched the grain of the wood, then read aloud, not from the book, but something he'd written on the inside panel with charcoal. "This crate is wood, but it's also a road." The others turned to look. "What kind of road?" someone asked. Ibrahim held up his book and said, "From my eyes to the world." Fatu smiled, not because the metaphor was perfect, but because it was his. Within weeks, the idea spread. Every time a banana shipment was offloaded, the empty crates were no longer burned or forgotten. They were cleaned, sanded, painted. Some became book corners. Others turned into science tables. One was even fitted with wheels and became a mobile story cart pushed from classroom to classroom. When inspectors from the Ministry of Education visited the school expecting to find crumbling blackboards and outdated syllabi, they instead found corners of creativity blooming from the most ordinary wood. They saw children tracing letters along crate slats, painting vocabulary words on panels, stacking books inside boxes once filled with fruit. They took pictures, asked questions, then they asked permission. 1 month later, a new directive was sent to all primary schools in the rural zones. Initiate pilot program, 1 crate, 1 corner. Schools were instructed to partner with local cooperatives to collect unused banana crates, repurpose them into reading or learning spaces, and encourage student ownership. Some crates became poetry corners, others became math benches. In one remote village, a teacher used 3 crates to form a U-shaped reading nook where children read aloud to chickens. But it all started with 1 box, 1 book, 1 boy who saw more than wood. That crate now sits in the school's main room, repainted each year by students. Its original stamp, Lot 041, is still visible under the fresh colors, like a fossil of intention. And next to it, etched permanently in the corner with black ink, are the words of Ibrahim. This crate is wood, but it's also a road. And no one ever asked him to explain it again. They didn't need to. It was just a number. Container 998. Stenciled in white across the rust-red steel, like the 997 before it, like the thousands still to come. It stood in the afternoon heat on the concrete slab behind the packing plant, its doors yawning open like the jaw of some sleeping beast. Inside, workers in faded uniforms moved with quiet rhythm, lifting boxes, scanning codes, stacking crates 6 high. The scent of ripe banana filled the air, sweet, heavy, overripe at the edges. A radio played somewhere in the background, half swallowed by the sound of tape ripping and forklift hums. Each box bore the same green logo, Faso Grown. Respect the root. Each was tagged with its origin, Cumbia, Kudugu, Kombasiri, once forgotten places, now stamped proudly on the side of export-grade produce. But this shipment wasn't just another delivery. This was the one that would tip the scale, the millionth kilogram exported since the beginning of the land revival. An invisible milestone, but one that every worker in the facility could feel in their bones. Among them was Fatu, now promoted from volunteer librarian to logistics supervisor. She didn't lift crates anymore. Her body was too tired, her back too stiff. But she made sure every barcode matched every box, sealed every pallet secure. But before the last crate was loaded, she approached one of the workers and handed him a small flat manila envelope. "No label?" he asked. She shook her head. "It goes in the center crate top layer. And don't crush it." Inside the envelope was a single card, handwritten, no signature, just 7 words. "This is not fruit, it is faith." The crate was loaded without question as requested. The envelope slid between 2 bundles of bananas, resting like a letter between prayers. No one checked. No one needed to. By dusk, the container doors slammed shut with a metallic thud. Bolts locked, a final barcode scanned. And then as the sun began to dip behind the silhouette of a line of banana trees, the driver climbed into the cab of the export truck. The engine rumbled. The workers stepped back. Container 998 rolled away. Its route would take it west across hundreds of kilometers of cracked roads and newly paved highways. Past checkpoints where guards would wave it through with quiet nods, some of them former students of the Green Brigade now in uniform. through customs at the capital, onto a freight ship bound for the Netherlands, its destination Rotterdam, Europe's largest port, and now one of the top buyers of organic produce from Burkina Faso. To the Dutch importers, it would be just another consignment. To the supermarkets, it would be just another shelf restock. To the consumers, maybe a curious label. Maybe a conversation. Maybe nothing. But the note inside wasn't written for them. It was written for anyone anywhere who might one day wonder, how did this begin? Why here? Why bananas? And if they looked closely, if they found the note, they'd understand. This wasn't about fruit. Not really. It was about what fruit represented soil that had refused to die. Mothers who refused to forget. Children who refused to leave. And one man, once a soldier, who had planted discipline into dirt. As the container disappeared into the horizon, a quiet fell over the packing yard. The machines powered down. The forklifts parked. Workers sat on crates and peeled overripe bananas for dinner. And Fatou stood alone at the loading ramp, staring at the empty slab where the container had been. A young intern came up beside her. "Why that crate?" he asked. Fatou didn't answer immediately. She was watching the road, though nothing was there. Then she said without looking, "Because faith should always travel further than we do." And the hum of the earth seemed for a moment to answer her back. The conference room smelled faintly of glass cleaner and too much air conditioning. A circle of white booths surrounded the stage, each bearing national flags, digital screens, and branded backdrops filled with arrows, metrics, and promises no one would remember by lunch. It was the Africa Continental Agritech Summit held in Kigali, a space where policy met pageantry and PowerPoints ruled the day. Delegates from 30 nations had gathered, each ready to showcase their best vertical farms in Kenya, solar irrigation in Nigeria, precision drones in Egypt. Hands shook, cameras flashed, data flowed. Then came Burkina Faso's turn. There was no light show, no USB stick, no keynote speaker in a suit. Instead, a woman in a simple brown head wrap wheeled a crate of bananas onto the stage. Just one crate. Silence rippled. A few delegates whispered. Someone laughed politely, assuming it was a prop for an upcoming reveal. But there was no reveal. The woman adjusted the microphone, cleared her throat, and said, "We did not bring numbers. We brought proof." She gestured to the crate. "These bananas grew in soil declared dead. They were watered by hands that once held rifles. They were harvested by children who once traced maps to leave this continent." She nodded toward the back of the room. The lights dimmed. A projector clicked on. A short video began to play. No narration, no background music, just ambient sound, wind rustling trees, chalk on paper. On the screen, a little girl sat cross-legged in a wooden crate filled with books. A stick dipped in ink gripped between her fingers. Slowly, shakily, she wrote, S-A-M-I-R-A. Then she looked up, smiled, and whispered, "That's me." The video ended. The room didn't clap. No one moved. The silence was total, heavy, not awkward, but reverent. Because they hadn't seen a statistic, they'd seen a shift. Finally, a delegate from Rwanda leaned into her mic and said, "They didn't bring products. They brought a path." Another stood, then another, not to speak, but to bow their heads slightly in acknowledgement. For the rest of the summit, no one mentioned yield charts. They spoke of resilience, of restoration, of systems that listened to the land instead of conquering it. A policy advisor from Ghana noted, "We came here looking for efficiency. They reminded us about dignity." After the session, the banana crate was placed in the lobby. Delegates paused to take photos. One woman touched the fruit with a trembling hand. A man from Morocco whispered, "It smells like something my grandmother once grew before the wells dried." No one dared eat the bananas. They weren't food now. They were evidence. At the closing ceremony, a final resolution was drafted, not focused on trade tariffs or export incentives, but on establishing a continental registry of grassroots agricultural innovation. The first project listed Burkina Faso, the banana crate model. Backstage, as the delegation packed up, someone asked the woman who had presented, "Wasn't it risky to bring just a crate?" She looked down at her hands, still sticky with banana sap, and replied, "Only if you forget what crates can carry." Then she turned gently, wheeled the crate away, empty now, but heavier than it had ever been. It began on a table made from 2 crates and a door. In the shade of an old acacia tree at the edge of the village square, TRAORÉ sat surrounded by elders, farmers, teenagers, and mothers with infants strapped to their backs. No translators, no microphones. Just a notebook, a pot of homemade ink, and a question that hadn't been asked in over a generation. What would it look like if trade worked for us? They didn't speak of GDPs or subsidies. They spoke of stories of spoiled shipments, of contracts, signed in languages they didn't read, of buyers who promised and never returned, of fruit that crossed oceans while their own children went to sleep hungry. So TRAORÉ opened the notebook and began writing. Slowly, by hand. No lawyers, no templates, no ministries, just sentences built from the soil. One by one, voices joined. A teacher suggested that every cooperative should retain 15% of net profits for community projects. A widow added that crates must carry not just product details but a message from the growers. A former soldier insisted that export conditions include a clause for replanting, not just harvesting. Someone asked, but who will sign it? The ministers, the foreign firms. TRAORÉ looked across the table. At Aissata, a 14-year-old girl, barefoot, eyes bright, holding a pen she'd carved from a banana reed. She'd been part of the Green Brigade. She had once traded a day's meal for an extra hour in the field library. TRAORÉ pushed the notebook toward her. You! Her hands trembled slightly as she dipped the pen into ink. Then with quiet determination, she signed her name at the bottom of the first page. Aissata Ouedraogo. Underneath she wrote, "This time the ink belongs to us." The room stilled. And then one by one others added their names, not in printed blocks, but in their own hand, some shaky, some bold. A banana farmer, a former refugee, a welder, a midwife. Each name a declaration that the rules would no longer be written far away in boardrooms with polished shoes and polished lies. This was not a legal document in the way the world defined it, but it was binding in the way the heart understands contracts. It would govern how they shipped, how they priced, how they dignified their own labor. The new charter was wrapped in burlap and sealed in wax. A digital copy was uploaded later reluctantly by a teenager with good Wi-Fi. But the original, written in ink made from local cassava and ground charcoal, was kept in a wooden box beside the village flag. Later that month, a revised shipment left Cumbia, Container 103. Each crate bore a new stamp freshly added beneath the product code, grown under the People's Charter, Article 1 compliant. When the container reached Rotterdam, the port authorities flagged it not for violation, but for curiosity. The stamp had no legal standing, yet it appeared on customs records, then in regional trade briefings, then in a feature in Le Monde titled, "Who Writes the Rules of Soil?" But far from the headlines, in the cool dusk of that same village, TRAORÉ stood at the edge of the loading zone, watching crate after crate disappear into the truck. A boy beside him asked why change the stamp. TRAORÉ didn't turn his head. He simply said, "Every crate carries fruit, but ours also carries proof." And with that, he closed the back of the truck with his own hands. Not as a politician, not as a leader, but as a man who once dug a hole in dry earth and refused to stop. It was the only rooftop garden on the street, surrounded by embassy buildings wrapped in tinted glass. In marble facades, the embassy of Burkina Faso in Brussels looked almost ordinary until you stepped out onto the top floor terrace. There beneath the gray Belgian sky, rows of banana trees swayed gently in the wind. They weren't tall, they weren't many, but they were alive. Their leaves caught the northern light like sails, and from below, passers-by sometimes stopped to stare, wondering why a diplomatic building had turned its rooftop into a tropical orchard. Inside the usual embassy, rules did not apply. No red carpets, no gold-framed portraits, no suits unless absolutely necessary. The ambassador, a woman named Seydou Zongo, had declared it from her first day. "If you want to understand our country, don't look at our GDP. Look at our gardens." That afternoon, she hosted a small gathering. No press, no protocols. Just an open invitation to taste. On the terrace, mismatched chairs were arranged in a circle. A cloth-covered table held a thermos of ginger tea, small bowls of banana chips dried in kudugu, and 2 jars of peanut paste. The snacks weren't catered. They were shipped directly from villages, One crate still had red dust in the corners. The guests came hesitantly, at first EU trade reps, NGO consultants, a young climate activist from Denmark, even a Belgian school principal who had introduced one crate, one corner in his classroom. They were greeted not with speeches but with a cup of hot tea and a simple question from the ambassador: "Have you ever heard of a woman named Mumbarka?" Most hadn't. So Seydou told the story of a mother who planted a tree with no promise it would bear fruit, of how she watered it with her own ration bowl, of the wind that broke it, and the hands that planted it again. She didn't wait for permission. Seydou said, her voice low but certain. She didn't wait for aid. She planted. She fed. She remembered. No one interrupted. By the time she reached the part where Mumbarka's banana field fed 300, the wind picked up slightly. The trees behind her rustled as if responding, leaves fluttering like slow applause. Then she passed around the bowl of banana chips. Grown from her soil, she said, sliced by her neighbor, packed by her student, shipped in a crate with her name carved into the side. The guests took a piece, each chewing thoughtfully. It was sweet, earthy, and just slightly smoky, like something touched by fire, but not defeated by it. One trade official cleared his throat. "Is this an official program?" Seydou smiled. "No, it's something better. It's a memory turned into export." Later, someone asked why the garden, why bananas, why here in Brussels. She poured another cup of tea and answered, "Because I want every diplomat who walks into this building to smell what the world tried to bury." That evening, after the guests had gone, Seydou stood alone under the fading sky. The banana trees cast long shadows across the terrace. Down below, the city lights blinked on. Somewhere in a nearby window, a child was doing homework under a fluorescent lamp. And above, in the soil-filled crates, imported not with paperwork, but with pride, the banana leaves kept swaying, rooted in a rooftop, speaking the language of sun and silence. They didn't ask for documents. No memorandums, no joint statements, no ceremonial signatures. Instead, they asked for seeds. It began a few weeks after the embassy rooftop event in Brussels. Word had spread quietly but persistently through trade networks, educational forums, and climate NGOs. Not about a policy, but about a pattern. Villages in Burkina Faso were feeding themselves with soil that was once declared dead. And they weren't just surviving, they were writing charters, sending crates, building schools, planting futures. Delegations from various countries reached out not with demands but with curiosity. A woman from South Korea's Ministry of Agriculture visited Cumbia notebook in hand, expecting reports and protocols. Instead, she was handed a watering can. In Chile, a mayor from a drought-stricken region started growing banana saplings on a municipal rooftop. He posted weekly updates online. His most shared photo was of 3 teenagers sitting beside the plants, reading aloud from books translated from Ibrahim's crate essays. Then came the formal invitations: Germany, Thailand, Colombia, India. All extended offers to host Burkinabe delegates at upcoming climate summits and food security forums. Most proposals included words like scaling, replicating, or globalizing. But when TRAORÉ read the emails, he simply smiled and said, "They want our fruit, but they need our roots." He selected not economists, but growers, not politicians, but teachers. And he insisted on one thing: no one speaks without soil under their nails. At the first summit in Rotterdam, they didn't carry binders. Each delegate brought a single crate inside, which sat a sapling, a bag of composted Faso soil, and a short handwritten story. No slides, no charts. When the Burkina Faso team stepped onto the stage, the moderator was confused. "Where are your materials?" TRAORÉ stepped forward, lifting the lid of the crate. Inside was a banana sapling, green and fragile, cradled in red gold earth. He placed it on the podium and said, "This is our document." In the quiet that followed, a Dutch delegate stood skeptical but intrigued. He walked up, leaned forward, examined the soil, touched the rim of the crate, then looked up and asked, "So you're telling me this was grown here?" A soft chuckle spread through the room. The Burkinabe delegate beside TRAORÉ answered calmly, "No, but its roots are in Faso." The room stilled, because it was more than metaphor. The soil was from Faso. The sapling had grown in Faso air, but it had survived a plane ride, a temperature shift, and foreign light. And now it stood on a European stage, not demanding attention, but deserving it. The moderator, no longer confused, stepped back and let them speak. They didn't pitch. They told stories. Of Samira's name. Of Mumbarka's stubbornness. Of a village that fed 300 without asking for applause. Of a container that carried faith, not just fruit. By the summit's end, no official resolutions were signed. No global trade deals inked. But 23 countries requested access to seeds. Not genetically modified strains, but the original banana stock from Cumbia, along with a short guide handwritten by Zeta himself how to listen to land. They didn't want a blueprint. They wanted to begin. And that was enough. As they left, one delegate whispered to another strange summit. The other replied, maybe. But I think we just watched the future grow in a box. And behind them, the crate sat quietly on the stage, its leaves unfurling ever so slightly as if listening. He arrived with a proposal printed on embossed linen paper, folded neatly into a leather folder. His suit was tailored. His pen cost more than a month's harvest. And yet, as he stepped into the small wooden office of the Embassy of Burkina Faso in Brussels, the first thing he noticed was the smell not of ink or polish, but of ginger tea, dried banana, and earth. The ambassador, Seydou Zongo, greeted him with a smile and a bowl of fresh chips. Welcome, she said. No necktie required here. Only taste. The Swiss investor, Hans, founder of a boutique agro-import firm, nodded politely, placed his folder on the table, and began his pitch. Charts, margins, distribution routes, a proposed exclusive contract for Faso bananas across high-end Swiss retail chains. He spoke fluently. Numbers danced. Terms were clear, but the ambassador didn't look impressed. She poured more tea, offered more chips. Then she said, before we read your proposal, I'd like you to read this. She slid a small piece of paper across the table. It looked handmade, rough at the edges, written in ink that had clearly bled slightly into the fibers. Hans picked it up. Before you invest in the fruit, invest in the soil it grew from. There was no logo, no footer, no contact info, just those two lines. He looked up, puzzled. This is a proverb. Zongo shook her head. No, it's a requirement. She explained no trade deal would be signed unless the buyer contributed directly to the land, not just the logistics. That meant funds for local composting programs, literacy for growers' families, and fair pricing tied to the People's Charter, signed in Cumbia. Hans leaned back. You're rejecting exclusivity, Zongo smiled. We're rejecting invisibility. The man sat silent for a moment. He had expected a negotiation, not a philosophy. Then he reached for another banana chip and chewed slowly. It was softer than he expected. Sweet, nutty, with something else behind it, an aftertaste not quite describable. What's in this? He asked. Zongo poured more tea, soil, story, and memory. Later that week, he withdrew his exclusivity request and instead submitted a revised offer, a partnership clause, that included a 10% reinvestment in farming education, a training program for single mothers in packaging villages, and a commitment to use Grown Under the People's Charter as a visible label. It was approved. Word of the exchange spread quickly, especially in the European business press, which expected yet another tale of resource extraction, but found a lesson in humility and flavor. Soon visitors began arriving at the Brussels embassy, not for visas, but for the banana hour. Every Friday afternoon, the rooftop garden opened to guests, diplomats, students, chefs, writers, anyone curious to experience what they had begun calling the Embassy of Bananas. A food critic from Lyon described the dried banana chip as less of a snack, more of a syllabus. A journalist from Lisbon compared the tea ceremony to agricultural diplomacy. A child from Ghent wrote in a guest book, The Bananas Here Talk. In Zurich, a food cooperative launched a pop-up store named Soil Story, where every product was labeled not by barcode but by the name of the farmer and the field. None of this was planned, none of it branded, but it traveled faster than paperwork ever could. And when someone asked Ambassador Zongo if she was surprised by the success, she simply replied, "Trade has always moved fast. We're just making sure it finally tastes like where it came from." A single banana seed is placed inside a glass case at the National Museum of Burkina Faso. It's not framed in gold or surrounded by fanfare, just nestled in soil from Cumbia under soft light. Visitors come and pause, reading the engraved plaque below. The land gave it to me. I just gave it back. Mumbarka. Next to the case is a photo of her hands cracked strong, stained with soil. No dates, no titles. Just the hands that fed a village. Children press their faces to the glass. Elders weep quietly, and somewhere between memory and tribute, a seed becomes sacred. A giant curved screen wraps around a darkened room in the museum. No text, no narration, just footage rows of banana trees swaying in the wind, children running barefoot between them laughing, vanishing into gold-tinted light. Visitors stand silently. Some smile, some close their eyes, some cry without knowing why. A young student whispers, pointing at the screen, "That looks like home." There are no guided tours, no buttons to press. Only one rule: listen, not with ears but with stillness. Because sometimes the most powerful thing a museum can do is stop explaining and let the land speak for itself. Night in Tiba village, no smoke, no crying, no hunger. Fires are no longer needed, they're solar now. Bellies are full, but voices remain awake. Children lie in hammocks under trees and sing a lullaby passed down from Samira and the Green Brigade. Their song is not about war or loss, it's about bananas and soil in a mother's hands. Mothers listen from doorways, fathers hum quietly from porches. And across the village, the only sound is joy, remembering struggle. As the last note fades, a teenager stands and says, almost as if reading a truth written on the sky, "We didn't ask for permission to be great. We just planted." And that was enough. What begins as a tale of drought and despair slowly blooms into something far more powerful. A quiet revolution rooted in dignity, resilience, and the belief that greatness doesn't need permission. At its heart, this story is not about bananas or farming. It's about reclaiming agency. TRAORÉ doesn't wait for aid. Zeta doesn't hide behind medals. Mumbarka doesn't seek sympathy. They act with their hands, their stories, their stubborn hope. And in doing so, they remind us that healing a nation doesn't always start with a speech. Sometimes it starts with digging a hole. There's a beauty in how this story never chases glory. It doesn't scream. It plants. It waters. It waits. And eventually it feeds. What's most profound is that every person, no matter how forgotten, finds a place in the reimagining of a country. A soldier becomes a grower. A grandmother becomes a provider. A child's name written in banana fiber ink becomes a symbol of what's possible when education is rooted in belonging. This isn't fiction trying to impress. It's fiction trying to remind that progress isn't always big or loud. Sometimes it's the quiet sound of a crate being nailed shut, a lullaby sung in the dark, or a sapling growing in unlikely soil. And perhaps the most important truth it offers is this: you don't have to be powerful to plant something that lasts. What would it look like if your own story started not with what you lack, but with what you're willing to plant? If this story touched you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Captain of Truth, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Captain of Truth.